0917 hours, January 22nd, 1943, west of Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. The jungle here wasn't a battlefield, it was an execution chamber. For the last 72 hours, the men of the 132nd Infantry had been dying at a rate of 1 every few hours, 14 men down, 0 enemy sightings. The Japanese snipers were using smokeless powder and flash hiders, remaining invisible while the Americans fired thousands of panic rounds into the canopy. Brute force was failing. But Second Lieutenant John George wasn't relying on volume of fire. He was crouching in a ruined bunker, staring through a 2.5 power Lyman Alaskan scope attached to a rifle his superiors had mocked as a civilian toy. He was alone, outnumbered 11 to 1, and about to prove that the only way to stop a ghost is to become one. But to understand how a competitive target shooter ended up fighting a private war with a hunting rifle, we have to go back to the doctrine that nearly lost the jungle. That doctrine was built on a fatal assumption that you could see the enemy you were shooting at. The U.S. Army of 1943 was an industrial juggernaut designed to fight a European war of maneuver. The strategic philosophy was fire superiority. The logic was simple and brutal. If a platoon takes fire, every man returns fire immediately and overwhelmingly. You saturate the area with lead, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down while a squad flanks them. It was a tactic that relied on volume, noise, and aggression. It worked brilliantly against German infantry in open fields. But the jungle of Guadalcanal was not an open field, and the Japanese Imperial Army was not interested in a fair fight. The Japanese had turned the jungle canopy into a three-dimensional fortress. While American commanders were studying maps, Japanese snipers were studying botany. They didn't just hide behind trees, they became part of the biomass. A Japanese sniper would climb 80 feet into a massive banyan tree before dawn, lash himself to the trunk with rope, and wait. He wasn't looking for a firefight. He was looking for a frantic lieutenant waving a map, or a corporal filling canteens at a creek. Crucially, the Japanese understood the physics of light and sound in the green hell. They were equipped with the Type 97 sniper rifle, a modification of the standard Arisaka infantry rifle. It fired a 6.5mm cartridge that was ballistically inferior to the American, 30 to 6 inches terms of raw power, but it possessed one terrifying advantage. It used a specialized smokeless powder that produced almost no muzzle flash. In the twilight gloom of the jungle floor, a muzzle flash was the only way to spot a shooter. By eliminating it, the Japanese sniper became a ghost. He could fire, cycle his bolt, and fire again, while the Americans on the ground scanned the trees in vain, seeing nothing but shadows and vines. Against this invisible threat, the standard American response was impotent fury. When a man dropped, the rest of the platoon would unleash reconnaissance by fire, spraying thousands of rounds into the surrounding trees. They shredded bark and leaves, but they rarely hit flesh. The Japanese snipers, tied securely to their perches, would simply wait for the panic to subside, then kill the next man who stood up. The casualty reports from the 132nd Infantry Regiment were grim reading. Men were being bled out not in grand charges, but in ones and twos, struck down by bullets that seemed to materialize out of thin air. The psychological toll was heavier than the physical one. Infantrymen began to fear every rustle of a palm frond. Patrols moved at a crawl, paralyzed by the certainty that they were being watched. The regiment was losing its offensive momentum because it was fighting a phantom. This tactical paralysis exposed a gaping hole in American military preparation: the sniper gap. Following the First World War, the U.S. Army had effectively dismantled its sniper program. The High Command believed that modern semi-automatic weapons made the dedicated marksman obsolete. Why train a man to fire one perfect shot when you could train 10 men to fire 8 shots in rapid succession? The embodiment of this philosophy was the M1 Garand. General George Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. And for general infantry combat, he was right. It was rugged, semi-automatic, and powerful. But for hunting a sniper in deep cover, the Garand was a blunt instrument. It was equipped with peep sights, iron apertures, that required the shooter to align a front post with a rear circle. In the bright sunlight of a firing range, these sights were accurate. But under the triple canopy jungle, where light levels dropped to a murky twilight even at noon, the peep sight was a liability. The dark metal of the sights blended into the dark background of the trees. You couldn't distinguish the target from the tool. Furthermore, the Garand was heavy, loud, and ejected a shiny brass casing with a distinct ping that announced the shooter's position to anyone listening. It was a weapon designed for a brawl, not an assassination. To the officers in the command tent, the solution was always more artillery, more mortars, more machine guns. They were trying to solve a precision problem with high explosives. But Second Lieutenant John George looked at the situation with the cold, analytical eye of a competitive shooter. He realized that the army was trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. The jungle wasn't a battlefield, it was a chaotic mesh of visual noise. To survive, you didn't need to shoot faster. You needed to see better. You needed to strip away the noise and focus on the single, unnatural detail, the break in the pattern, the glint of a lens, the unnatural straight line of a rifle barrel against the curve of a branch. The 132nd didn't need more firepower. It needed a counter-sniper. It needed a man who understood that in this specific hell, the only thing that mattered was the ability to deliver a single, silent pill of lead into a 4-inch target at 200 yards, unseen and unheard. But the army didn't have that man on the roster. It didn't have the rifle in the armory. And according to the regulations, it didn't want them. Fortunately, Second Lieutenant John George had never cared much for regulations. While his fellow officers at Camp Forest were memorizing infantry field manuals, George was a student of a much older, more exacting school of warfare, the national matches at Camp Perry. Before he wore an officer's bars, George was already the Illinois State Rifle Champion. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a ballistic scholar who viewed the trajectory of a bullet with the same rigorous precision a civil engineer applies to a bridge. When the 132nd Infantry shipped out, George did something that would be considered a court-martial offense in a modern army. He packed his own personal weapon. It wasn't a standard-issue carbine or a pistol. It was a heavy, bolt-action sporting rifle that had arrived in a crate marked fragile via military mail. To the uninitiated supply sergeants, it looked like a deer rifle, a polished relic from a gentleman's hunting lodge that had no business in the mud of the Pacific. But to a marksman, it was a masterpiece of industrial art, the Winchester Model 70. Specifically, it was what collectors today revere as the pre-64 Model 70. The distinction is critical. In 1943, Winchester was still manufacturing rifles using a design philosophy borrowed from the legendary German Mauser 98. The heart of this system was controlled round feed. In a standard push-feed rifle, the bolt simply pushes the cartridge from the magazine into the chamber. If the shooter panics, if his hands are shaking from malaria or fear, and he fails to pull the bolt all the way back, the rifle can try to feed a second round while the first is still in the chamber. It's called a double feed, a catastrophic jam that requires seconds or minutes to clear. In the jungle, those seconds are a death sentence. But the pre-64 Winchester was different. It featured a massive, non-rotating steel claw extractor on the side of the bolt face. As soon as the cartridge rose from the magazine, this claw grabbed the rim of the brass casing and held it in a mechanical vice grip. The round was under total control from the moment it left the magazine until the moment it was ejected. You could cycle the bolt upside down, underwater, or while rolling into a shell crater, and the rifle would feed and extract with clockwork reliability. It was a weapon designed for dangerous game animals that hunt you back. George knew that on Guadalcanal, the Imperial Japanese Army fit that description perfectly. George had paired this mechanical perfection with a Lyman Alaskan scope. Again, the choice seemed counterintuitive to the layman. It offered only 2.5 power magnification, barely more than the naked eye. A novice might have demanded 10 power or 12 power optics to see closer. But George understood the optical physics of the canopy. High magnification narrows your field of view to a pinhole. Looking through a 10x scope at close range is like trying to find a target through a drinking straw. The 2.5 power Lyman offered a massive, bright field of view. It allowed George to keep both eyes open, scanning the deep shadows of the banyan trees, gathering precious light in the gloom. It wasn't designed to zoom in on a button on a shirt. It was designed to clarify the chaotic visual noise of the jungle, separating the organic curve of a branch from the hard, straight line of a rifle barrel. But the most radical innovation George brought to the jungle wasn't hardware. It was a concept known as the cold bore shot. The army trained men to fire until the barrel was hot, adjusting their aim as they walked their rounds onto the target. George knew that a sniper only gets one shot. The cold bore shot is the most difficult in marksmanship because a cold barrel behaves differently than a hot one. The metal is contracted, the harmonics are stiff. The point of impact can shift by inches. George had memorized the cold bore deviation of his Winchester. He didn't need a warm-up. He treated the jungle not as a volume fire zone, but as a surgical theater. He stripped the rifle of its civilian pretensions. He removed the factory sights to accommodate the scope mount. He checked the bedding screws, ensuring the action was torqued precisely to the wood stock to prevent shifting in the humidity. He loaded the internal magazine not with soft-point hunting rounds, which might deflect on a twig or vine, but with standard military 30-06 M2 ball ammunition. This was the same full metal jacket cartridge used by the machine gunners. It was designed to punch through light cover, to drill through the thick, fibrous wood of the banyan trees and kill the man hiding behind it. John George was ready to hunt. He had the skills of a champion and the weapon of a master. But in the eyes of the United States Army, he was just a junior lieutenant with a mail-order sweetheart, carrying an unauthorized toy into a combat zone. And before he could fight the Japanese, he would have to fight the skepticism of his own commanding officers. That skepticism was loud, public, and relentless. When George first uncrated the Winchester back in Tennessee, the reaction from the platoon wasn't awe, it was derision. In 1943, the aesthetic of American military power was mass production, Parkerized steel, unpolished wood, and gas-operated actions. George's rifle, with its blued steel barrel and checkered walnut stock, looked less like a weapon of war and more like a piece of furniture from a country club. The infantrymen, scrubbing the carbon out of their rugged Garands, looked at George's bolt-action relic and asked if he planned to ask the Japanese to pause the war while he worked the action. They christened the rifle the mail-order sweetheart. It was a nickname dripping with condescension, implying that both the weapon and the man carrying it were too delicate for the brutal reality of the infantry. The primary point of contention was the scope. To the World War II infantry officer, a telescopic sight was a liability. Glass breaks, lenses fog. In the humidity of the Solomons, where fungus grew on camera lenses overnight and leather boots rotted off feet in a week, relying on a fragile optical tube seemed suicidal. Captain Morris, George's commanding officer, viewed the setup with open hostility. He saw a lieutenant who was prioritizing a civilian hobby over military uniformity. He ordered George to leave the toy in the supply tent and carry a real weapon, a carbine, or a Garand that could deliver the volume of fire the doctrine demanded. George refused, but he did so with a technical rebuttal that silenced the room. He demonstrated the Griffin and Howe quick detach mount. This was a specific piece of precision engineering that allowed the scope to be removed from the rifle in 2 seconds by flipping 2 levers without losing its point of aim. If the glass broke, or if the fighting moved to close quarters, George could strip the optic and use the rifle's iron sights instantly. He wasn't carrying a handicap, he was carrying a dual-purpose system. Morris grunted, unconvinced, but allowed George to keep the rifle, likely assuming the jungle would destroy it within a week. But the jungle didn't destroy the rifle. It destroyed the regiment's confidence. When the 132nd Infantry relieved the Marines at Guadalcanal in late December, the mockery evaporated, replaced by a cold, sweating dread. The Point Cruz Groves were not a duck blind. They were a meat grinder. The Japanese snipers here were not the theoretical targets of training camp. They were veterans who had survived months of bombardment. They knew the terrain down to the individual tree stump. On January 19th, the abstract debate about volume of fire versus precision ended in blood. Corporal Davis was shot through the head while filling canteens at a creek. He never heard the shot. The next day, 2 men from L Company were dropped while on patrol. Again, no muzzle flash, no sound, just men collapsing into the mud. The battalion reacted by the book. They saturated the tree line with machine gun fire. They called in mortars. They leveled saplings and shredded vines. But the next morning, as the sun burned off the mist, another man was shot through the neck. The snipers were killing the 132nd faster than malaria. The atmosphere in the command post shifted from skepticism to desperation. The Japanese were operating with impunity, and the standard tools of the U.S. Army were failing to dislodge them. The invisible enemy had created a psychological cage. Men were afraid to move, afraid to look up. The offensive had stalled because you cannot assault an enemy you cannot see. That night, the battalion commander summoned Lieutenant George. The conversation was short. The laughter was gone. The mail order, sweetheart, was no longer a joke. It was the last option on the table. The commander didn't ask about the durability of the glass or the speed of the bolt action. He asked one question: can you hit them? George didn't offer bravado. He offered credentials. He listed his dope data on previous engagement. He explained that at 600 yards, he could hold a group the size of a dinner plate. At 200 yards, the engagement distance of the jungle, he could hit a target the size of a grapefruit, first round, every time. He explained that the Japanese snipers were human, and like all humans, they had to see to shoot. If they could see him, he could see them. And if he could see them, the mathematics of the 30-06 cartridge guaranteed they would die. The commander looked at the casualty reports, then at the strange, scoped rifle leaning against the tent pole. He gave George the green light. He had until morning to prove that a competition shooter could succeed where a regiment of infantry had failed. The toy was going to war. At dawn, George would enter the groves alone, hunting the men who had been hunting them. At dawn on January 22nd, George stepped past the perimeter wire and vanished into the Point Cruz Groves, carrying the weight of that ultimatum on his back. The transition from the American lines to the no-man's land of the jungle was jarring. Behind him lay the noise of the battalion generators, shouting sergeants, clanking mess kits. Ahead lay a silence so profound it felt pressurized. The jungle here was a cathedral of rotting vegetation, dominated by massive banyan trees that rose 100 feet into the air, their aerial roots creating a chaotic curtain of wood and vine that blocked sight lines beyond 20 yards. George didn't patrol. He didn't walk. He found the ruins of a Japanese log bunker, crawled inside, and did the one thing the American infantry had been too impatient to do. He sat perfectly still. For 3 hours, he did nothing but breathe and watch. This was the discipline of the competitive shooter, the ability to enter a state of active patience. He raised the Winchester, resting the forestock on a rotting log, and began to glass the canopy. Here, the genius of the 2.5 power Lyman Alaskan scope revealed itself. A high magnification scope would have magnified the heat shimmer and the swaying leaves, creating a nauseating blur. But the low-power Lyman acted like a light vacuum. It gathered the dim ambient light of the jungle floor and clarified it. Through the lens, the chaotic wall of green resolved into distinct layers: foreground vines, midground trunks, background canopy. George scanned, using a grid pattern left to right, top to bottom, dissecting the jungle 1 square foot at a time. He wasn't looking for a man. A man is too easy to hide. He was looking for a violation of nature. A straight line in a world of curves. A patch of brown that didn't match the bark. A shadow that fell the wrong way. At 0917 hours, the jungle betrayed its secret. 240 yards away, 80 feet up in a banyan tree, a branch moved against the wind. George froze the crosshairs. Through the clear optics, the anomaly sharpened. It wasn't a branch. It was the distinctive, unnatural geometry of a rifle barrel. George adjusted his position by millimeters. He followed the barrel back to the stock, and the stock back to the shoulder. The Japanese sniper was wedged into a fork in the tree, his body wrapped in a camouflage net of dyed hemp, his legs secured to the trunk with ropes. He was facing away from George, watching the trail the Americans used for water runs. He was waiting for a thirsty corporal to make a mistake. George began the firing sequence. This was the moment the mail-order sweetheart earned its keep. The M1 Garand possessed a heavy 2-stage military trigger that required a long, gritty pull before firing a creep that often disturbed the aim at the last microsecond. The Winchester Model 70, however, had a trigger that broke like a glass rod. 3.5 pounds of pressure, 0 creep, 0 over-travel. It was a connection between the shooter's mind and the firing pin that was instantaneous. George exhaled, pausing at the bottom of the breath, the respiratory pause, where the body is most stable. He applied pressure. The sear released. The rifle bucked into his shoulder, the recoil sharp and familiar. The report of the 30-06 cracked through the silence, a single thunderclap that sent flocks of birds screaming from the canopy. 240 yards downrange, the physics of the M2 ball cartridge took over. The bullet, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, smashed through the foliage and struck the sniper's center mass. The impact was kinetic and final. The Japanese soldier jerked violently, his rifle tumbling from his hands and clattering through the branches. His body slumped forward, held aloft only by the ropes he had tied to secure his position. He hung there, a grim effigy in the canopy, swinging slightly in the stillness. George didn't cheer. He didn't move. His hand instinctively flew to the bolt handle. Up, back, forward, down. The massive Mauser claw extractor ripped the spent brass from the chamber and flung it aside, feeding a fresh round with the oily smoothness of a bank vault door closing. He settled back into the scope. One shot, one kill. But the jungle was waking up. The crack of the rifle had revealed his general position. Somewhere in the trees, 10 other snipers had heard it. They knew the sound wasn't a Garand. They knew a hunter was in the groves. George waited. Patience was a weapon. At 0943, a second sniper, panicked by the shot and fearing he had been spotted, tried to slide down the trunk of a tree 60 yards to the north. Movement is death. George tracked him through the scope, leading the target slightly to account for the descent. The trigger broke again. The second sniper fell backward, hitting the jungle floor with a wet thud. By noon, the dynamic of the Point Cruz sector had fundamentally shifted. For 3 days, the Japanese had been the predators, invisible and untouchable. Now, they were being dismantled by a force they couldn't understand. It wasn't a machine gun spraying wildly. It was a single, terrifyingly accurate eye that seemed to pick them out of the sky. By the time the sun began to dip, George had fired 5 rounds and killed 5 men. The toy rifle was clearing the battlefield that a battalion had failed to take. But as he made his way back to the American lines that evening, George knew the easy part was over. He had proven the concept, but he had also alerted the enemy. The remaining 6 snipers were the best of the pack, the ones who hadn't moved, hadn't panicked, and were now waiting for the man with the bolt-action rifle to return. The duel was just beginning. That duel would span 4 rain-soaked days and redefine the tactical reality of the Point Cruz sector. The Japanese snipers, realizing they were being hunted by a marksman of equal skill, adapted with terrifying speed. They ceased all daylight movement. They stopped using the obvious high perches in the banyans and moved lower into the dense palm fronds and spider holes at the base of the trees, sacrificing field of view for concealment. They began working in hunter-killer teams, one man to act as bait, another to watch for the muzzle flash of the American who took the shot. George countered with a level of tactical patience that verged on the masochistic. On the 3rd day, he spent 9 hours in a water-filled shell crater, submerged up to his chest, watching a single cluster of trees. He didn't eat. He didn't move to swat the mosquitoes swarming his face. He simply waited for the biological imperative to force an error. At 1,400 hours, a Japanese soldier, confident the sector was clear, shifted his weight to relieve a cramp. The movement rippled a palm frond 20 yards to George's left. George rotated his torso slowly through the muddy water, aligned the Lyman scope, and fired. The 6th sniper fell. By the morning of January 25th, the tally stood at 10. The Groves, once a loud zone of American panic fire, had fallen into a tense, brooding silence. The Japanese were running out of specialists. But the 11th man, the survivor, was the most dangerous. He knew George's general location. He knew the rhythm of the bolt-action rifle. And he was waiting. The final engagement wasn't a feat of shooting. It was a feat of psychology. George located a suspicious shape in a palm tree, a dark mass that looked like a sniper's hide. It was too obvious. A novice would have fired. George waited. He scanned the periphery, ignoring the bait, searching for the trap. Minutes ticked by. Then, 80 yards to the right of the decoy, deep in the shadows of a hardwood tree, he saw it. The glint of optics. The 11th sniper was watching the decoy, finger on the trigger, waiting for George to reveal himself. George shifted his aim to the real threat. The shot was difficult, threading the bullet through a gap in the vines the size of a coffee cup. The Winchester cracked. The 11th sniper dropped from his perch, his rifle clattering down branches as he fell. The bait in the palm tree, a stuffed uniform, remained motionless. 11 confirmed kills in 96 hours. The mail-order sweetheart had done what an entire battalion's worth of mortar crews and machine gunners could not. It had decapitated the enemy's defensive line. When George walked back into the perimeter that evening, covered in mud and smelling of swamp water, the atmosphere in the 132nd Infantry had transformed. The jeering was gone. The toy rifle jokes had evaporated. Men who had previously looked at his scoped rifle with disdain now looked at it with a kind of superstitious reverence. They weren't looking at a sporting good anymore. They were looking at a tool that had saved their lives. Captain Morris, the commanding officer who had ordered George to leave the rifle in his tent, didn't offer an apology. In the Army, you don't apologize, you adapt. He simply handed George a canteen and pointed to the map. The mockery was replaced by a new, urgent demand. The regiment didn't just want George to shoot, they wanted him to clone himself. Word had reached Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. The success of the civilian tactics had exposed the failure of the military doctrine. Ferry revealed that the division actually had a cache of specialized weapons gathering dust in a supply depot. 14 M1903 Springfield rifles equipped with 8-power Unertl scopes. These were former Marine Corps sniper rifles, intricate and heavy, that no one in the Army unit knew how to use effectively. They had been left in crates because the officers deemed them too delicate for combat. Ferry offered George a new mission. Take these rifles, take 40 of our best shots, make them like you. George accepted, but the transition from shooter to teacher highlighted the massive gap between qualified and competent. The 40 men Ferry sent him were expert marksmen on the firing range. They could punch holes in paper bullseyes at 300 yards all day long, but when George took them into the jungle, they were helpless. They looked for targets that stood out against a white background. They waited for a whistle to fire. They didn't know how to read negative space, the gaps between the leaves where the enemy actually lived. George built an impromptu sniper school 2 miles east of Henderson Field. He stripped the men of their reliance on the heavy, stabilized, prone position of the firing range. He taught them the jackknife, a contorted posture used by hunters to shoot downhill. He taught them to use the loops of their leather slings to lock the rifle to their arm, creating a bone support structure that was as stable as a sandbag. Most importantly, he taught them the difference between the Unertl and his Lyman. The Unertl scopes were magnificent instruments, long, thin tubes with external adjustment mounts that looked like laboratory equipment. They offered 8x magnification, 3 times powerful than George's hunting scope. But George taught them the danger of that power. With 8 power, he told them, you can count the buttons on his shirt, but you'll never see his flanker moving in to kill you. He trained them to keep both eyes open, to use the scope only for the final second of the engagement, and to live in the wider world of their peripheral vision. Within a week, the 132nd Infantry had deployed its first true scout sniper section. They weren't operating by the standard Army field manual. They were operating by the John George method: light footprint, heavy patience, and the precise application of violence. The toy rifle hadn't just cleared a grove of trees, it had shattered a dogma. But as the Guadalcanal campaign wound down and the Japanese evacuated the island, George realized that his beloved Winchester and the era of warfare it represented was living on borrowed time. The jungle was about to get deeper, the mountains higher, and the enemy more desperate. And a new myth was about to be born, one that would follow George for the rest of his life, based on a technical lie that he would never quite be able to correct. That lie persists to this day, repeated by historians who understand video games better than they understand industrial history. As the war shifted from the static, rot-filled attrition of Guadalcanal to the mobile nightmare of the Burma campaign, the legend of John George's rifle began to drift into mythology. Modern retellings often claim that in preparation for his deployment with the legendary Merrill's Marauders, officially the 5,307th Composite Unit, George upgraded his Winchester with a lightweight synthetic stock. This is a fabrication that betrays a fundamental ignorance of the era. In 1944, synthetic rifle stocks were the stuff of science fiction. There was no carbon fiber, no fiberglass molding available to a lieutenant in a staging area in India. The truth of what George did to his rifle is far more visceral and far more revealing of the man's obsession. He didn't buy a solution, he carved one. The Burma theater was not merely a combat zone. It was a physiological crucible. The Marauders were tasked with a long-range penetration mission, hiking over 700 miles through the Himalayan foothills and dense bamboo jungles to seize the airfield at Myitkyina. In this terrain, gravity was as lethal as the Japanese. Every ounce of kit had to be paid for in calories and sweat. A standard 10-pound rifle, after 20 miles of vertical ascent, felt like it weighed 50. George looked at his mail-order sweetheart, the rifle that had saved the 132nd Infantry, and saw dead weight. He didn't order a plastic part from the future. He took a wood rasp and a drill press to the walnut and steel. He sporterized the weapon with the ruthlessness of a darker age. He shaved the beautiful walnut stock down to a sliver, removing the checkering, the fore-end bulk, and every gram of wood that wasn't structurally essential. He didn't stop at the wood. He drilled holes in the magazine box and the trigger guard, turning solid steel into Swiss cheese to shave off mere fractions of an ounce. He swapped the heavy leather sling for a thin web strap. He replaced the steel butt plate with a lighter material. By the time he was finished, he had reduced the rifle's weight significantly, transforming a gentleman's sporting arm into a skeletonized tool of war. It was ugly, scarred, and utterly professional. This wasn't the act of a soldier following a tech manual. It was the act of a craftsman modifying his hammer to fit his hand. This obsessive modification marked a pivotal moment in the history of military small arms. John George was effectively prototyping the concept of the modern sniper system 20 years early. He proved that a sniper rifle is not just a rifle with a scope slapped on top. It is a holistic system where weight, balance, optics, and mount must be tuned to the specific demands of the mission. His work in the garage in India prefigured the development of the U.S. Marine Corps M40 system in Vietnam, the Remington 700 bolt actions that would eventually formalize the doctrine George was inventing on the fly. But unlike the Marines of the 1960 seconds, George was operating without a support network. He was a singular anomaly, a gun nut in the truest sense, dragging a custom-built precision instrument through the worst conditions on Earth. However, the Burma campaign would prove to be the Winchester's final and most grueling test, not of ballistics, but of relevance. The fighting in Burma was different. It was often sudden, vicious ambushes at ranges of less than 20 yards in bamboo thickets so dense you couldn't traverse a long barrel. While George did use the Winchester to silence Japanese machine gunners at 400 yards during river crossings, the volume of fire from the M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns increasingly dominated the engagements. George survived the dysentery, the malaria, and the Japanese bullets that decimated the marauders. But as he walked out of the jungle in 1944, gaunt and exhausted, he carried a realization that was heavier than his rifle. The era of the civilian surgeon, the idea that a lone man with a hunting rifle could change the course of a war, was ending. The industrial machine was taking over. The army was standardizing. The next war would be fought with mass-produced snipers trained in mass-produced schools, carrying mass-produced weapons. The mail-order sweetheart had done its job, but it was becoming an artifact. The rifle that had cleared the Point Cruz Groves was no longer a weapon of the future. It was the last gasp of a dying philosophy of individual marksmanship. And that is why, when you see it today, it sits behind glass, silent and unassuming. That silence now lives on the second floor of the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. If you walk past the display case today, you might miss it. Surrounded by the menacing black silhouettes of modern tactical rifles, John George's Winchester Model 70 looks almost pedestrian. It looks like what it ostensibly was, a deer rifle, worn smooth by time and travel. But if you lean in close, you can see the scars of the rasp on the stock, the fading bluing on the barrel where the humidity of the Solomons ate away the finish, and the precise, hand-fitted mount of the scope that officers once laughed at. This rifle is more than just a museum piece. It is a physical testament to a moment when the American military machine blinked. For a brief, terrifying window in 1943, the industrial might of the United States Army, with all its artillery, logistics, and manpower, was brought to a standstill by 11 men in trees. And the only thing that broke that deadlock wasn't a general or a new doctrine. It was a stubborn lieutenant from Illinois who refused to accept that mediocrity was the price of uniformity. John George proved that in the chaotic noise of modern war, where volume is often mistaken for victory, there is no substitute for the terrifying silence of competence. He didn't just kill snipers. He killed the idea that a soldier should be a cog in a machine. He reminded the world that one man, with the right tool and the discipline to use it, can still hold the line when the system fails. If you believe that the true history of warfare is found not in the movements of armies, but in the mechanics of the men who fight them, then you are in the right place. Help us keep these stories alive by hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications. We are digging through the archives every week to find the rebels, the innovators, and the outcasts who won the war despite their own command. And John George wasn't the only one fighting a two-front war against the enemy and his own bureaucracy. While he was carving his stock in the jungle, another heretic was in the skies over Europe, screaming at the Army Air Corps that their bombers were flying coffins without his engine. Join us next time as we climb into the cockpit of the P-51 Mustang to discover how a British engine saved an American legend.